Hello, government students. Today we're going to talk about the principles of American government. These are the principles of government that are embedded in our Constitution. So without further ado, let's get started. The very first principle I want to talk about today is popular sovereignty. So that comes from two words, popular meaning the people or the population. Sovereignty means, of course, the right to rule. We talked about sovereignty as one of the characteristics of a nation state back earlier in the semester. The right to rule, the right to control your own destiny. So how is popular sovereignty reflected in the United States? Well, it's reflected through the voting process. And popular sovereignty really is the huge contribution that John Locke made to our form of government here in the United States. The next characteristic of American government that I want to talk about is the rule of law. The rule of law is sometimes referred to as limited government or constitutionalism, but you can use these terms pretty much interchangeably. I like to use the rule of law, but sometimes you may hear me refer to it as constitutionalism or limited government. There are two aspects to the rule of law. First of all, the power of the government is limited. So there is limits to what the government can do. Those limits to what the government can do are given through the laws. So even the government must obey the law. And secondly, the law should treat everyone equally. Notice I said it should treat everyone equally. I have here in writing it will treat everyone equally, but in the real world, we all know that that's probably not the case. But we strive to do that. The law strives to treat everyone equally. And clearly, when we talk about the rule of law, the law should apply to everyone equally. And that is our goal. Next up comes the separation of powers. And I want to make sure that we remember that the separation of powers is talking about the branches of government. It is not talking about federalism, the separation or the division of power between state and national government. A lot of students get that kind of mixed up. So when we say separation of powers, we're talking about government being divided among three separate branches: the legislative, the executive, and the judicial branches. Okay, so that's the separation of powers. And you may recall that that idea was first proposed by the French philosopher, the French philosophe Montesquieu. Montesquieu, when he proposed the separation of powers, that had never been actually implemented anywhere before. The United States was the first country to actually implement the ideas that had been proposed by Montesquieu. So it was a bit of a risk on the part of our founding fathers, but they did believe, and probably justly so, that separation of powers is absolutely necessary to maintain a truly free society where the government does not become overbearing. Related to the idea of the separation of powers is the next characteristic, and that would be checks and balances. And you really cannot have checks and balances without the separation of powers. So let's see what we're talking about here. A check is the idea that each branch of the government is able to limit the power of the other two branches. And by balances, we mean that each branch of the government should be roughly equal in power. Now, in the real world, sometimes one branch will assert its power a little bit more effectively than other branches. They're not truly equal in power, but it's always a constant tug of war. But the goal is, and the reality is, that no single branch is truly overwhelming the power of the other branches. They all maintain checks, and they all maintain some semblance of balance with each other. So let's look at some of the checks, and let's start with looking at checks on the legislative branch. These would be ways in which the other two branches ensure that the legislative branch does not get too powerful or abuse its power. First of all, the veto. A president may veto the laws passed by Congress. That is a check on the legislative branch by the executive branch. Judicial review. The judicial branch may declare laws unconstitutional and void. So the Congress may pass a law, the president may approve it, but it's ultimately up to the Supreme Court or the lower courts who have the power to determine that whether or not that law is in fact constitutional. And if the courts determine it is not, that law is no longer going to be in effect. It is void. Now, not every law is going to be reviewed by the courts. I want to make sure you understand that. For a law to be reviewed by the courts, there has to actually be a trial, a case in which someone believes their rights have been abused in some way. And then the courts will get involved, but only after someone has gone to court on the purposes of the law that's being in question. Now, you notice I have a blank line there. I want to make sure that you remember this. Judicial review was first used in the Supreme Court in the early 1800s, very early 1800s, in the Supreme Court case Marbury versus Madison, M-A-R-B-U-R-Y versus Madison. That's where the courts first exercised their right to judicial review to declare a law unconstitutional. So make sure you remember that. Let's look at some checks on the executive branch. One way that the executive branch is checked is that the Senate must approve presidential appointments. So that's a check that's exercised by the legislative branch on the executive branch. The president can't just appoint anyone. The Senate gets to approve whoever the president wants to put up in some kind of an appointed position, such as a court justice. Judges are appointed by the president, but only after the Senate approves them. Same with members of the cabinet, like your Secretary of State, Secretary of Treasury, etc., etc. All of those appointed positions must be approved by the Senate. And of course, an important check on the executive branch is the power of Congress to impeach the president and any of his appointees. And also, the president, if he starts abusing his right to veto, his vetoes may be overridden. So Congress can still, provide a check on the power of the president to veto by overriding that veto if enough members of the Congress will agree to do that. And finally, this is sort of like a check on the part of the judicial branch to the executive branch. Once a judge is appointed by the president, that judge cannot be fired by the president. So the judicial branch maintains its power. Once those judges are in place, the president is powerless to do anything about it. In fact, there's an interesting story. President Eisenhower appointed a man to be the Chief Justice of the United States, and his name was Earl Warren. And when Eisenhower appointed Warren to be Chief Justice, Warren was the conservative Republican governor of California. Well, when Warren got to be on the Supreme Court, all of a sudden he was no conservative. The Warren Court issued some of the most far-reaching, some would claim very liberal decisions in the history of the Supreme Court. And Eisenhower said it was the biggest mistake he ever made as president was appointing that man to Chief Justice, but there was nothing Eisenhower could do about it. So that's one of those interesting facts about our Supreme Court. Once in power, you're there. Okay, let's look at some checks on the judicial branch. Judges must be appointed by the president, so that gives the executive branch some power over the judicial branch. Judges must be approved by the Senate, so that gives the legislative branch some power over who gets to be in the judicial branch. And judges, just like members of the executive branch, can be impeached by Congress. We've never had a Supreme Court justice impeached, I believe. We've had some come close, and one or two actually decided to resign rather than face impeachment. But so far, I believe no one has been impeached while they were sitting on the Supreme Court. We have had federal judges in lower level courts, in appellate courts and district courts, be impeached by Congress. Last one I want to talk about is federalism. Federalism is the powers of the government being shared between the national or federal government and the state governments. Again, I want to make sure you don't confuse federalism with the separation of powers. So federalism is the division of power between the national and state governments. Federalism in the United States Constitution is kind of divided among, those powers are divided up, and we say we have delegated powers, we have reserved powers, we have concurrent powers. Delegated powers are powers that are used solely by the federal government. Reserved powers are those powers that belong strictly to the state governments, and concurrent powers belong to both the federal government and the state government. So it's through this division of powers that we have federalism in the United States. Let's take a look at some of the delegated powers. Now, there are many of them, and just so you know, most of the delegated powers are seen in Article 1 of the Constitution, Section 8. We'll likely go over some of those in class before long. But the delegated powers would include, for example, printing and coining money. We remember under the Articles of Confederation, the states could print and coin money. That no longer is the case. That is now a delegated power that only the national government has. Only the national government can declare war on another country. Only the national government can have an army and a navy. Now, we do have a militia. The state militias do exist, but they cannot go to war against a foreign country unless the state militia is called into service by the president, and the president does have that authority to do that in times of war. Okay. Delegated powers would include making treaties with other nations, maintaining uniform weights and measures. In other words, it is a delegated power of the national government that says here in the United States we're going to have miles and not kilometers. We will use feet and yards rather than meters and centimeters. So those are your weights and measures. We use pounds. We do not use kilograms. So that's a delegated power. It is a delegated power to maintain the post office and to regulate interstate commerce. Make sure you understand that interstate refers to commerce between states involving more than one state. If it's commerce or something involving something only within a single state, that would be called intrastate. Intrastate commerce is just commerce within a state. Interstate commerce crosses state lines. Let's look at some reserved powers. Again, these are the powers that belong strictly to the states. The word reserved powers comes from the 10th Amendment, which says that certain powers are reserved to the states. So 10th Amendment gives us these reserved powers. That would include issuing licenses like your driver's license, my marriage license or marriage certificate, my teaching license. Those are all state powers to issue those things. The state can regulate intrastate commerce, commerce that just happens within the borders of the state. It is a state reserved power to conduct elections. That might seem surprising, but in fact it is the states who manage the election process. And that is now a fairly controversial thing because right now certain states have been putting into place some rules that make voting in presidential elections a little bit more difficult. Particularly for people who live in cities, limiting the number of places where you can cast your ballot, or limiting the ability to cast an absentee ballot. But this is all within the state's reserved powers. It is a state reserved power to ratify amendments to the Constitution. So any amendment to the Constitution cannot be approved unless the requisite number of states approve it. Can you think of any more? I can. For example, how about the speed limit on highways? That would be a reserved power as well. There's many more. Okay, last let's take a look at concurrent powers. These are powers that are possessed by both the states and the national government. That would include taxing. We have state taxes as well as national or federal taxes. Setting up courts. There are federal courts in our system. There are also state courts. State courts deal with situations in which a state law would have been broken as opposed to a federal law. We have concurrent powers building highways. We have state highways as well as federal highways. Chartering banks and corporations, again, concurrent powers. Eminent domain, the right of the government to seize private property for the greater social good. Both the states can do that and the national government. And there's more, but that's about it. You get the idea. You want to take note of a few of those. And with this, we're done for the day. Check Canvas, see what's there. There may be an assignment. Talk to you later.